We're live. So, good evening and welcome to another edition of State of the Union. I'm your host, Kevin Kimble, founder and CEO of the Financial Services Innovation Coalition and the executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Global Policy Initiative. Tonight, we're going to talk about the most recent Supreme Court ruling on voting rights, its implications, and possible courses of action. And we're very lucky tonight to have our guest, friend, and mentor, Matt Engel, the founder and director of the Lone Star Project out of Fort Worth, Texas. So, Matt, thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Happy to be here. Wish it was under better circumstances.
I would say, but now every show is about bad circumstances. There is no happy shows these days. So, before we jump into the meat of the subject, can you give a little bit about the background of the Lone Star Project and why you are in this space you're in?
Yeah, it certainly is relevant to what's going on now. I founded the Lone Star Project back in 2005 as a unapologetically political partisan pack in order to overcome one-party control in Texas. And it wasn't, though, just because I'm a Democrat and they're Republicans. We had just come out of the famous Tom DeLay mid-decade redistricting, in which that was the first really time in the South in which Republicans dramatically used racial gerrymandering and discriminatory gerrymandering in order to achieve their partisan goals. And so if you're wondering where this fight really started, it started in Texas way back in 2003 when Tom DeLay passed a redistricting plan that undermined the voting strength of Blacks particularly, but also Hispanics all across Texas. That model was picked up and has been used ever since then. And the court has little by little used that approach in order to undermine and gut the Voting Rights Act, particularly Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
So I guess we should, people probably have heard something on the news about this, but they probably don't know or understand very much. Let's talk about what just happened. So I don't want to go too far back, but so there was Section 5 that got gutted several years ago, and then there's Section 2. So can you kind of draw the lines between that and what happened this last week?
Yeah. The first big blow, the first real shot at the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is the section that is supposed to guarantee African Americans and other traditionally discriminated minorities the opportunity to protect their influence at the ballot box at the district level. Where congressional districts are drawn, state legislative districts are drawn, county commissions are drawn, city councils. And from 1965, and it was then amended in the 70s, you had most southern states, including Texas, but most of the old South states couldn't make any changes in their voting laws unless they were pre-cleared. And the Justice Department stamped them and said that they don't discriminate or retrogress or reduce the voting strength of people of color. Okay. In 2013, the Supreme Court in the Shelby versus Holder decision, they took away that pre-clearance requirement. They said they no longer had to pre-clear. And so what that meant was that jurisdictions should go in and they can make dramatic changes to voting laws and to districts, and that the only remedy was then to go to court. But the way the court justified gutting Section 5 at that time was said, well, you always have Section 2 to go to. You can always sue. You can sue to get your rights. Well, now here we are about 13 years later, and now they've gutted Section 2. So if you, and they basically said that racial gerrymandering can't be proven unless you can determine that it wasn't done with partisan concerns as the primary reason. And and while there still is some language that says, well, you still can't intentionally discriminate, they've created the standard for intent so high that, a legislator would have to go, yes, we're going in here, and the reason we're drawing this map is to undermine the voting strength of Blacks and Hispanics. Well, they never say that. They're never going to say that. They always cloak it in partisan terms. And because Republicans have done so much damage to African Americans over the years, African Americans normally vote for Democrats in a block. Democrats don't always deserve that vote, frankly, but because the Republicans push the African Americans away so aggressively, then Democrats, sometimes we earn the vote, sometimes by default, but there's no question that African Americans vote as a block for Democratic candidates, particularly in the South.
So that's a lot. That's a big mouthful. So given that, so what happens next? I mean, I think people are paying attention. Several states are doing special redistricting, special maps. Like Tennessee just did one all through the South. So what does that mean? Now that the court is basically taking that last bit of protection away.
Well, things are turned on their head.
Okay.
Things are turned on their head. Most of these districts in the South, they exist because they were drawn as voting rights districts. They were drawn because the law required that you had to create a district in which minorities could elect the candidate of choice if you could prove that the population was large and concentrated enough, and prove that there had been a history of discrimination. Well, in just about any Southern state, there's a long history of discrimination, and you don't have to go back 30 years or 50 years or 70 years. You can usually go back a couple of years in most of those states. But now the very fact that these districts were created with a racial intent is the evidence, is the reason that they're saying that they can now, that they'll say they have to, that the law makes them go and dismantle these districts. And we already saw it. We saw it today in Tennessee, in which the Memphis district there, which had been a longstanding district where African Americans elect their candidates of choice, they carved it into 3 different pieces and made it part of districts that went off into the rural parts of Tennessee. And they did it earlier this year in Texas, in which they they literally eliminated a black district in Houston by combining it with another existing black district and then shedding all the rest of it into hopelessly Republican districts. And then in North Texas, taking a district in Tarrant County where Fort Worth is and just dismantling a district that African-American Congressman Mark Vesey represented.
Is it possible that they can do even more now that the Section 2, like they don't have anything? Could they cut that into even more, like in Texas, get rid of all the black districts?
I don't think they can. Well, I think if they try to get rid of all the black districts, that's when it starts to blow up on them. Because Texas has more African Americans within its boundaries than any other state. Even though it's only about 13% of the population, it's a lot of black voters. And so I think what you'll see in Texas is mega or ultra packing of black districts, so that you could end up, though, with only 1 district in Houston, and you could end up with only 1 district in North Texas. And then you could have maybe 3 or 4 Hispanic districts in San Antonio and across the South. And then the rest of the state would be controlled by white voters. And remember that Texas is a state in which only about 39% of the population is Anglo.
Wow.
But we have 38 congressional districts. So you could have a circumstance in which 31 out of 38 districts are controlled by Anglos, even though they only make up about 39% of the population. You could see a similar circumstance in other states. It's not out of line that they will go after even the most senior members. Jim Clyburn in South Carolina, you could tear up that Charleston district and just put it off into rural parts and eliminate that as the only district in South Carolina.
What about Mississippi with Benny Thompson?
Mississippi with Benny Thompson too.
Yeah, that's one. So let me ask you this. I'd look back to try to get some frame of reference. So in 1988, so before, I guess, there was a big lawsuit, I guess, that caused all those Section 2 seats to be created coming into the 90 census.
It was, what you had in the 1991 redistricting, there was a really important lawsuit that was won on, and so then you had a circumstance in 1991 where across the South, a bunch of districts were created so that mostly African Americans, but in some states, in Texas and a couple others, you also had Hispanic seats were created. Now, at that time, the Republicans were licking their chops. They're saying, okay, we're going to work with the Black community, but we're only going to do it to only help them create super PAC districts.
Districts, right,
And so
right.
they try, and in fact, they had a crude name for that strategy. They called it Operation Rat F, and they bragged about it, and so they thought, and they did use that in order to eliminate a bunch of districts where you had Anglo Democrats getting elected, and they were in districts that are 25, 30% Black, but not sufficient in order for the Black candidate to elect their candidate of choice. So that was basically, even with that, I guess, impure motivation by the Republicans, it was good for our country, and it was good for African Americans who were being elected in states that had anywhere from 15 to 50, almost 50% of their population was Black, but now that we've gotten further along, and as African American voting strength has increased, I mean, they aren't doing this because the African American vote is weak. They're doing it because it's strong, and so they want to undermine that using districts and using voting laws, and it's really important that. Particularly in districts where boundaries can't be changed, county level races, city level races, statewide races, that we do a better job of really motivating all potential Democratic voters and the African Americans is usually the most important part of that coalition. And then we mobilize that in order to make the Republicans pay a price for what they do, make them not so eager to draw these types of districts. Because I've seen a lot of Republicans over the years. They don't like to run in marginal districts. They want safe districts. They want districts that are 10-point margins. Well, if you have strong performance of African Americans across district lines, then they'll be less likely to come in and do gross gerrymanders because, again, they want to protect their seats first.
So, talking about I want to actually do that bigger thing, but I want to bear down on this so people in the audience can get a frame of reference. In 1988, there were 22 Black members of Congress. So do you think we're headed back to that number between now and the 2030 redistricting or 2031?
Probably not that low, but I could see it under 30. And certainly closer to 20 than 30. You could have that. The difference is that we've created African American districts in Democratic states now. There are a lot more African Americans in Democratic states, and Democrats aren't going to dismantle these districts.
That was the other question, right? Okay.
Now, I do think that you will have, though, a little bit of pressure, for lack of a better word, we might say incentive, for some African American representatives who have had districts that have more concentrated Black population than they need to be elected, to understand that maybe rather than, I don't really need a district that's 45, 50% African American, I can get elected and my successor could get elected as an African American person at 39, 40%. That's usually the margin around there that makes it effective. It depends on the jurisdiction. Sometimes it's even lower than that. Mark Vesey served for over a decade, and his district was never 30% Black. But Blacks dominated the primary, and as a result, they dominated the general election. So you have circumstances like that. It will call for more cooperation and coordination, but you won't have Black seats in New York, New Jersey, Illinois, California. In places like that, you won't see those districts go away. What you're going to see is in the South. Okay.
So what's the party going to do? So one of the things we've been talking about, and you and I've talked about this a lot, is that the Democrats don't invest a lot of money in Black turnout, Hispanic, and then operationalizing, talking to the communities. Does this change, put more focus on that, or does it make it less likely that they focus on?
It better be more of a focus, because again, we're not going. This is going to get worse unless we start to win elections in jurisdictions beyond congressional states. We've got to win more states. We've got to win more county elections, so that we have executives in place We have attorney generals in place in all the places in which you can control what is done legally. And also, we need to control more legislatures. And they won't just redraw Congress, by the way. They'll be redrawing state legislatures as well. There was a lot of congressional districts were created in 1991 and in 2001 as a result of the Voting Rights Act. But hundreds of legislative districts where blacks can elect their candidates of choice were drawn at the county level and at the state level. And so those elections have to be engaged in. I think there has to be a real conversation, and everybody has to kind of show their whole card in terms of the Democratic Party and a lot of elected officials, whether they're black, Hispanic, or Anglo, who sit in safe seats, relatively safe seats, who usually don't do much in the general election because they're going to get elected. I think that their resources and the party resources have to really be focused on turning out particularly black voters, because they're, we can say this, they were after all minority voters, but it was more black voters than anybody else that's hurt by this ruling.
So explain that. So why is versus Hispanics or others?
Well, because Hispanics, first of all, have never been as reliably Democratic. African Americans, when African Americans vote, they usually vote somewhere between 85 and 95% for the Democratic candidate. Usually the way African Americans express their displeasure with Democrats is by not voting at all. Whereas Hispanics, the hard Democratic support among Hispanics has never been more than 55%. And then we'll usually, because the Republicans are anti-Hispanic too on almost every policy, we can often get up to 65, sometimes 70%. But that's more of an elastic population. And so there are districts in which Hispanics can make up 60% of the population, and then only and then when you account for citizenship, maybe just barely under 50% of the citizen voting age population, and then elect their candidate of choice or not. And so if 10% swing to Republicans, then they win those. The Republicans, they're willing to take that gamble in some places. That's what they've done in Texas. They drew 5 districts that they think that they can elect. Well, 3 of those count on them getting at least 45% support among Hispanics. I'm not sure they get that every election, but they might from one election to another.
So this, we're presumably Trump's doing really poorly, and so this next election, a lot of Republicans who might otherwise win in a regular year probably going to lose. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that those districts are still bad districts. It's really important that you said that. Just because we win a district doesn't mean that minorities didn't get screwed in it. A Democrat winning and minority voters being able to exercise their full strength at the ballot are 2 different things. Right.
And also, I think it's important that we sometimes do okay in the middle of these decades, and we had a pretty good year in 2018, but we came around in 2020 when it was the critical year for redistricting, and we lost those seats.
Same happened with Clinton too, right? It didn't happen in 2000.
We lost the 2000 elections, and so when they redrew in 2021, Republicans had the pins in most critical states. Where, not to go back too far in history, but the really bad loss was in 2010. Leading into the 2011 redraw. And again, that's what set up the Shelby decision and all those things. Was the redrawing that came after the 2010 election.
Every election mattered. Because we lost a bunch of state, like almost 1,000 state legislature seats and all that stuff in governors.
And the Republicans thought about that. They worked on it for 20 years. We were pretty conscious of it, frankly. In 81 and 91, but I kind of came off the ball and in 2001, but then by 2011, 2021, I was off the ball. Why do you think that was? President Obama was a great president, but he didn't pay a lot of attention to the census and to redistricting.
Great's a relative on this audience. I don't know if great would be the term that most people use, but that being said, I do think
I respect other people's opinion, but let me tell you, relative to what the alternatives have been, I'd say.
With the ball, I guess we're shooting kind of low, right? The bar's pretty low.
Yeah.
how do the citizens how do we impact this? That is, I've talked before, for a lot of people who listen to the show, like even with a bunch of Black people in office, the quality of life for Black Americans has not been very good. Like, we've been watching all these, I've been sitting around these memes like white people saying Black people Trump's helping Black people too much, or this, and the Black people have too many opportunities. That seems to be driving a lot of conversations. And so how does this group engage better? Like how do we make sure that the party committees pay attention? Because they don't seem to, like I said, the eye is off the ball. And what do we have to do?
I think it's three things, and none of them are easy. All of them are important. One of them is that parties are and politics, apart from the personalities, are cold-blooded. If you win and you have influence, you have, and if you win and you can move voters, then you have influence. And I think it's very important that African-American leaders and African-American individuals demonstrate their strength at the polling place. And then the second thing is demand that your leaders, demand that the people that you elect, then go and be your voice, be your strong advocate, not just on the policies that you care about. That's very, very important. But when you're voting as part of the minority, you're going to go make a good argument and win it, but you're going to lose the vote.
Oh, right.
But to make your argument to the people who hold the checkbook. And in some cases, I mean, Hakeem Jeffries is probably going to be the speaker,
you think he'll be speaker
of the House. I do think Democrats win a majority in the House. He's going to be speaker. Okay. He if he wants to stay speaker for very long, then there needs to be a real investment. In some cases, a reinvestment. Sometimes it's the first investment ever in turning out African-American votes, and not just in jurisdictions that are seen as the African-American community. You've got Black growth, particularly through the suburban areas. That's what's scaring Republicans to death, is that you've got African-American growth, particularly growth of Black middle class voters who are much more likely to engage. And there is frustration across racial lines and where we're going economically. And the Republicans, they like to point to, somebody who's Black's getting something that you're not getting. But what they want to do is keep everybody resentful and not look at the people that are picking their pocket. And then the third thing is that the African Americans that do have the ability to raise and give money need to do it. No Democrat gives as much as they should or could, but I do. There are successful African American business owners, entrepreneurs, and I think that there's not a culture of engaging in politics as a giver.
Yeah. No, I remember Congress after this said to me that we took our off the ball. People stopped being political. It started after this, the second generation after the voter rights. You hear people always say, "I don't need politics. Politics is, I'm outside of politics. I'm about business," and they lost sight of they took their eye off the ball as well.
Yeah.
How do we, I would use people in New Jersey. We have a big contingent in New Jersey. They actually run ads, they do text messaging, all this. They do a lot. How do they get on the list for the DCCC or the DNC to partner them and actually give them resources so they can go from 100,000 text messages to 500,000 text messages?
I think it's important is to don't try to be clever. Be a squeaky wheel. Go to the leaders who need your votes. Mikey Sherrill got elected by a coalition. If the African Americans hadn't played an outsized role in that coalition, she wouldn't have won. But she won comfortably, and she wants to get reelected. And so I'd certainly go to Mikey Sherrill. I would also get the African American members, and there's some strong African American members from New Jersey. They need to go to the speaker, and they need to go to Ken Martin, the DNC chair. And I mean, New Jersey is an important state. It's an important state at every level, and it's not Trump did better in New Jersey than people thought he was going to do in 2024, and that could have gotten away from us.
Yeah. And I think that's, people, because people are out of the mix. So we're trying to figure out how to make this happen.
But when I say squeaky wheel, though, go in with your strength, know what proportion, and know, be able to go and say, look, we made up this percent of the vote. We made up this percent of and 9 out of 10 of us voted for you. Go find another group that can say that.
Yeah, right. Don't take it for granted, right? No.
Yeah. When the white people come in, you're lucky if it's 1 out of 3. So
right. Seriously,
right.
How do you? Because it does seem to be there's a lot of talk among African Americans that they need to split their vote up more. That being so reliably Democratic has made it easy for people to ignore their contributions or their value.
Well, here's the reason that's a mistake. Somebody needs to earn your vote. You don't give it. You don't. I mean, you're giving it away free. If the Republicans want your votes, let them do things to earn it. And what we've seen here is they've made a decision. They've made a strategic decision that they would rather undermine, pack, crack, and destroy the voting strength of African Americans than lift one finger in order to earn their vote. Right. They've made that decision. And so if you go up and say, okay, we're going to kind of shed off and give some of our vote, they'll just say, thank you very much, and then screw you over anyway.
As they do with a whole lot of different people, right?
Exactly. Or they'll pick out one person. We'll make this person a party officer or something like that. In Texas, you have Wesley Hunt, who was kind of their shining Republican African American member. Well, he ran statewide in Texas, thought that everybody liked him so much he was going to be the Senate nominee. He met the same fate that every single other African American who runs statewide as a Republican in Texas. He got beat by 2 white guys. So,
what happened to the black mayor of Dallas?
First of all, he's failing. He's a terrible mayor. But Eric's a very smart guy. Eric Johnson. He's a very smart, IQ smart, very smart guy. But he's somebody that never was willing to engage really in the nuts and bolts of Democratic politics, and he was frustrated. And then so the Republicans went and kind of, courted him and said, we'll put you on this committee or on that committee and everything. But the truth of the matter is that after he switched, he hadn't gotten anything from them.
Gotcha. His
time as mayor has been failed. He's been a failed mayor.
You spent a lot of time in Congress, working on the Hill and working the DCCC. One of the things that's frustrating to a lot of people is that the CBC members. I don't want to speak for the Hispanic Caucus, although I just talked to a couple of Hispanic people earlier today to talk about this. That the minority members of Congress, and even at the state and local levels, didn't do a good job. Like even though people are unhappy about the Voting Rights Act, they're not necessarily sympathetic to the members who are going away.
It's what I call, and it's not just the black members of Congress, the Hispanic members of Congress, it's the members in safe districts. It's what I call the safe district complex, in which I'm okay, and it's not my job to worry about anybody else. And I don't want to rock the boat at home, or I don't want to, among some safe members, and again, this is not just in the Black Caucus, but others, I don't want to get a lot of political activism going on in my district, because there might be some ambitious young person who suddenly looks at me and says, hey, I can do a better job than him or her. And so I think that's why voters have to challenge their incumbents to be more than just a good vote. You've got to be a real advocate. You got to be a political advocate as well as a policy advocate.
Yeah, I've grown fond of saying that we don't have a political problem in our society. We have a management problem. Like the voters no longer manage the members who aren't our leaders, but who work for us. So everyone's forgotten who works for who.
Yeah, and safe districts sometimes do that, and you have a number of members, and again, some of them are good, very good members, good people, but they kind of get fat and happy. But now, let me tell you, Republicans are not going to let anybody. You're going to get fat and get butchered.
Happy is
happy is not an option anymore, and so Republicans aren't going to let particularly African Americans sit in safe districts, or they might let a few of them. They might boil it down to 18 or 20, 22, 23, but they're going to pack them as many as they can, and so it's really important, and I think particularly in 2026, for them to immediately see a reaction. And that means that all those Republicans' margins got cut too close, and they lost districts, and they lost statewide races. I mean, we have a U.S. Senate race in Texas, and if African Americans make up 13% of the turnout and support the Democratic candidate at 95%, he's got an excellent chance to win. So you got to have 13% of the voting population decide, a Democrat winning in Texas for the first time in 50 years.
So that brings back to my original point about investment. How heavily is that Senate candidate investing in African American people to turn out to be a part of his coalition?
I think there's a kind of interesting reason in Texas why I think there's going to be more attention paid than there would be. I think there is a higher understanding in James Tallarico's campaign of how important blacks are to his coalition. But I think it's even more so because you had Jasmine Crockett run such an aggressive and capable campaign and really demonstrated that there is a lot of black activism, and they're kind of watching and saying, okay, the Jasmine didn't win, but are you going to reach out to her voters and you're going to do what needs to be done in order that they know that they're part of their coalition? At least at this point, I feel good about James doing that. And to Jasmine, to her credit, she immediately endorsed James and urged people to support him. And so I think there is an understanding that, we can't argue the perfect against the good. That luxury is gone. We got to find a way to as Democrats, like it or not, we're a coalition party. Yeah. And we only win if we can make that coalition work. Republicans can line up all the white people and go run and win. We have to build a racial coalition.
So this is maybe a little more sensitive question, but something I did want to, I've talked about a lot I think on the show and others about the fat and happy thing you talked about. That, several years ago, you and I had this conversation, and I went to a couple of members and said, for the voting rights, that, they should vote against the debt ceiling until they got voting rights, and they were afraid or they didn't want to do it. Again, how do we fix that problem? I mean, again, whether they would have won that fight or not, they should have fought. I mean, they were going to lose. They were on a losing trajectory, and the lack of fight seemed to have been part of their unwillingness to risk anything.
What always happens on that is that there's actually a willingness to take a lot of risk collectively. People don't like to take risk individually. And so, okay, I'm willing to jump into that water, but you jump first and get three people to jump before me. And so, I mean, that's what happens. And also, and again, that's why, I ended up coming out of the Biden presidency so disappointed in him and his people that they weren't going to force the Manchin and the others to break that filibuster. They really didn't want to do that. They really believed that the filibuster was kind of good for government, and that was the big mistake, frankly, Kevin. I don't think it wasn't that you didn't have some Black Caucus members and others willing to die on the sword for a principle. It's that you had a president and there are people around them that weren't willing to make the structural changes you need to give yourself a chance to win.
Well, so it seems to me like what you just actually kind of squared the circle. On either end, there was no one willing to take the hard. No one was willing to jump off a cliff on either side to make that. So is that a function of Black people not being important enough to the system for people to care, or just
no? I think it goes to almost a naivete in thinking that after Trump's first term, now let's get back to normal. Okay. And they didn't understand that normal is gone.
Yeah, or what normal is Tom DeLay in 2005.
Normal is gone, and you've got to make structural changes. And I think, again, African American and other Democrats of conscience, that needs to be a litmus test for our leaders. It needs to be a Senate candidate. You got to be willing to overcome, at least on constitutional issues and on fundamental budget issues. You have to get away from needing 60 votes, having to get Republicans to come along with you, because they aren't going to do it. And that ought to be an absolute litmus test for anybody we nominate for president.
So what do you, so we're 2 years in on Trump, and the elections will be what they'll be. What's the next phase for, like, how do we defend, how do people between now and the redistricting in 2030? Because how do people defend their city councils or seats there? I mean, the congressional seats are going to be what they're going to be, but like you said, there's a lot of other places we don't want to see get wiped out.
Well, one of the places where I think where you have nonpartisan city council seats, school board seats, things like that, that's where you still can talk about things in terms of racial opportunity, because the Republicans can't say, oh, we want to draw 5 Republican seats or 6 Republican seats, because nobody's elected as a Republican. And so I think that that's a really important legal strategy that has to be a different legal strategy locally than at the partisan offices. But apart from that, though, city council races, school board races, they're low turnout. They're low turnout and disproportionate turnout among people of color. You can control the school board. The mayor of there's a city in Texas, in this county that I'm in, Mansfield, Texas, that is a city that forever was seen as a Republican city and regressive. It was one of the last places where one of the last high schools in Texas to integrate. Well, it has a black mayor right now, even though blacks only make up about 30% of the city's population, because he was able to mobilize and turn out African Americans, and he's a really good mayor, and so he got reelected too. And so in Pearland, Texas, which had traditionally been Republican, just elected an African American mayor.
Wow. Okay. So that for people who are like in Missouri, or even people who are in other places, New Jersey, for instance, whatever, maybe at some point you can do a seminar on that. Like, we can pick some states and people and point out some, like, I know people complain about judges a lot. Let's say, if the judge is elected, we can target those judges. We did that in San Antonio one year when I was working.
Absolutely.
So that people can get a real visual on how they can, like, make a difference in
areas. In those county level races in Harris County, which is where, as you know, where Houston is, I mean, it's a giant county. It's got 4.3 million people in it. If it were a state, it'd be bigger than 22 states. African American population there is large enough to make up 24% of the vote. If you mobilize and turn out that 24, you'll elect African Americans in all kinds of races. And right now, more than half the judges are African American. And a lot of the key county offices. That's Christian Menifee, who's now a member of Congress. He first got elected as county attorney in Harris County. Wow.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good point. I think, because we want to be actionable. So finding like school board races and stuff where you're not we take control of some of these areas.
Well, and that's the bench for your people who are going to run for attorney general, run for lieutenant governor, run for governor. Yeah. And it's one of the things. You could have a situation in the South where we're electing black governors.
Right. Because the percentage is high enough.
Mississippi should elect the blacks for statewide office, but just the turnout has not been sufficient.
So is that because no one's tried to turn them out? Getting to our point about people not investing resources in turning them out, or what's
it's a chicken and an egg thing. It's because you've got a population that's a little younger, poorer, and less tradition of voting. Then the view is, well, it'll cost too much to do all those things. And so then they don't vote. But I will tell you that the chicken or the egg here is money. Money and organizational talent. Yeah. And we're going to have to figure out that if we're going to elect a president with enough electoral votes, you're going to have to start carrying some southern states, because the electoral votes are moving south. And it won't matter if we're carrying Illinois and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin if you're losing, Texas,
The map is red.
and you got to start winning in some of those southern states.
So, well, Matt, we're almost out of time. This is really good. I really should do a seminar. I mean, this is like people. I do think this kind of tactical especially for the people who watch this show and who are active. I think it's really important for them to figure out how they can, because they do feel unempowered. I think that's the wrong answer. I know they put up Tracy put up your link to your website, and so hopefully people will check it out. I mean. Do you want to close out with anything? I don't want to keep you long.
Well, I'll just say that it is important that people not fall into despair. That's the first line in their strategy. Let's discourage our opponents. And in 2026, I think it's more important than ever that we win everything we have a chance to win. We don't leave anything in the table. We've got a political atmosphere. Donald Trump is the most unpopular incumbent president at this point in his presidency in modern history. It's not likely to get better. His base is discouraged. We need to make sure that we don't let him off the hook. Now's the time to put the foot on the gas.
Well, for everybody listening, make sure you go to check out Matt's website and come back, and then go to Physics YouTube channel. Make sure you hit the like and subscribe. And Matt, really appreciate you doing this, and thanks for your time.
All right, thank you, Kevin, and for all you do.
Appreciate it. Good night.
Good night.